We are Aldea, a spiritual community for people of all kinds of faith backgrounds, or those who don't have any experience with spirituality or religion. And what connects us are values like love and open-mindedness, rather than doctrine or dogma. Our ability to create this inclusive and welcoming space is made possible through donations from people just like you. So whether you join us regularly in person or you tune into our messages from all over the place, if you enjoy what we're up to, we would so appreciate it if you'd consider giving to Aldea, whether it's a one-time gift or setting up a recurring donation. You can find more information on how to give in the description of today's episode. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy today's message. Not too long ago, I had the incredible opportunity to go hiking at the Grand Canyon for the very first time. And upon arrival, my friend and I discovered that it had snowed and that the path was incredibly slushy. And I'm already afraid of heights. And so I'm slipping along this path. I'm also experiencing the Grand Canyon from a walking perspective for the first time. And so I feel like my life is flashing before my eyes. I'm picturing my gravestone. It says something like, "Jake, he died as he lived, ill-prepared." And so my friend and I decide, okay, look, if we're going to feel much better about this, we need to turn back. We need to go back to the Grand Canyon General Store and buy a piece of equipment that's going to help ensure my footing. And this piece of equipment, some of you might know, it attaches to your shoe, much like a chain attaches to a tire, and it has spikes that help you, ensure that you can, dig into the ground. And this piece of gear is called, which I just feel, look, I know it's low-hanging fruit, but I just feel that crampons, I feel like we could, there's a million other things you could name that. I don't know. Foot chains, So I put my crampons on, and I still didn't feel fully 100% secure because, again, if you look, it's still pretty tenuous. And so I kept my eyes on the path the whole time. And yet what's interesting is in life, we don't always do this. We don't always keep our eyes on the path. In the ancient Hebrew, there is a word called halachah. At least I'm assuming that's how it's pronounced. I am part Jewish, so that's where the ch comes from. And this word is often used within the Hebrew tradition to talk about God's will, God's law. And yet what's interesting about this word is that in its most basic literal translation, it means the way of walking. So this ancient people, when they thought about the will of their God, when they thought about the best way of being in the world, they actually thought about it not as a destination, but as a path, as a way of moving through the world. Jesus would later come along and elaborate on this idea. He would talk about the wide path and the narrow path. Carl Jung, many years later, in his internal work of psychoanalysis, would talk about the individuated path in a process he talked about called individuation, in which we all recognize that we have an internal journey that we all must go on, and that journey is to fully become the self, the unique self that you and I each are. And then finally, author Carlos Castaneda talked about the path as having heart. He said, before you embark on any path, ask the question, does this path have a heart? If the answer is no, you will know it, and then you must choose another path. Is this path your path, the path made only for you? And the question that we've been asking in this series is this: what is the connection between that individual path that belongs only to me and the universal path that all humans share? And I wonder if it means that to fully walk on your path, that it also means that we must do some work to recognize, to create an awareness for the universal path that we all go on. And Joseph Campbell, the language that he gave about this path was the hero's journey. That was just one way that he chose to label it. And the hero's journey is something that, as that video describes, shows up in all kinds of stories throughout human civilization, shows up in all kinds of mythology and narratives, and it still is all over the place today. And what do all these different stories have in common? They come from the human imagination. So there must be something about this pattern and this framework that reflects something deep inside of us. And I hope that throughout this series that you see yourself reflected in this journey. The author Thomas More says this: "We are on the hero's journey when we submit to the deep processes of life and allow them to affect us and bore their necessities into us. We are the hero when we take on the challenges and go through our initiations and transformations, enduring loss and gain, feeling happy and sad, making progress and falling back. The hero is engaged in life. The hero may not look heroic from the outside, but may go through powerful developments in a quiet way. The difference is that the real hero engages life and reflects on it. She becomes more and more what he or she is destined to be." Last week, we began to lay out the structure and the pattern of the hero's journey, and we found that it is a circular pattern in that you end where you begin. You cross the threshold, you begin in the known, you move into the unknown, and you come back to the known, and you are different. You have changed. And what we're going to explore today as we dive in a little deeper to this concept is that the hero's journey also functions like a bit of a clock. There are different points and stages that we move along the way. And if you were to go after this message, if you were to walk out and Google the framework of the hero's journey, you're probably going to find a variety of different ways that people choose to label each stage, and they're all valid, but this is the framework that we have chosen today. And another disclaimer I do want to give is that as we look at the specific stages of the hero's journey, remember that you can be in multiple hero's journeys at any given time, that these overlap. So maybe in your career, you are at one stage in your journey, and in your relationship, you are at another. Or it's possible that your hero's journey is all-encompassing at this point in your life. But all hero's journeys, they begin at 12 o'clock. The status quo. Things are normal. Things are ordinary. Maybe you're the type of person that you enjoy that sense of stability, that things are settled, things are copacetic. Or maybe if you're like me, sometimes the status quo actually makes you feel a little uneasy because you know that there is a journey that you will eventually be called to. And it's something that I have to work on, learning to enjoy the status quo more. The status quo also represents or can represent the innocence of childhood, or simply the innocence of not yet having been called to your journey. This is Harry Potter in the broom closet of his aunt and uncle's house, not yet understanding that he's actually a wizard. This is Luke Skywalker as a farmer on Tatooine, not yet even knowing that he has the potential to become a Jedi. I had some feedback last week as we talked about the movement from the ordinary into the non-ordinary, and some people shared with me that their journey never felt ordinary. They never felt a sense of status quo. And those experiences are valid as well. And maybe in some sense that was your status quo, that your ordinary was not ordinary. Your stability was chaos. And maybe your journey actually led you into a more ordinary world, but it was not ordinary for you. And so this can look all different types of ways. But the ordinary world is often labeled the village. And I feel like that's very apt, given that our name is Spanish for village. And the thing about the village is it's the community. You begin in community and you end in community, and you go out on this journey to bring gifts back to the community. The village that I grew up in was the village of evangelical Christianity. And in that village, things worked. Things felt like A plus B equals C, and everything kind of, I know how to navigate this world, and everything's pretty familiar. But eventually, in our lives, sooner or later, A plus B does not equal C. The things that used to work don't work anymore. And this is when we experience the call to adventure. It's a stirring. It's a feeling like something isn't always right here. Maybe it's that need, that internal need to explore, to find something more. Or maybe the call to adventure isn't within. Maybe it comes from outside of you. Maybe you are pushed onto your hero's journey. Peter Parker didn't choose to be bit by a radioactive spider that led him on the journey of becoming Spider-Man. It wasn't his choice. He was pushed. And what's interesting is, within that call to adventure, there's sort of a subcategory, which we might call the refusal of the call. See, what happens is there are moments in our lives where we feel the call, and yet another voice comes along and says, do you really think you can actually do this? You start to question yourself. You start to talk yourself out of the journey before it even begins. I grew up about an hour outside of LA. And so, like I said, growing up in this Christian community and yet feeling this call, there was this point in my life where I felt like I needed to go on my journey. And so I told everyone, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to move an hour west to LA, and that's going to be my journey. And so I quit my job, and I was like, I'm moving to LA, because I'd never heard of commuting before. And so I said, okay, I'm going to quit my job. And they were like, okay, good luck. And then I was like, okay. And then I started to create the preparations to actually move. And of course, I felt the refusal of the call, and I backed down and I said, I don't think I'm going to do this. Can I have my job back? And they were like, yes. And then 6 months later, I did the same thing a whole other time, and I quit, and then they gave me my job back. I felt that refusal of that call, that feeling of self-doubt that came in. You probably have those moments where you felt like, I'm stirred, I'm drawn towards something, but I don't know how it's going to be possible. I best not do it at all. And this is why, at exactly the right moment, in comes the assistance, the appearance of a guide, a mentor. This is Obi-Wan. This is Gandalf. This is Mr. Miyagi. This is the fairy godmother, someone older, wiser, maybe in the context of many of these stories, even someone magical who appears into your journey to give you that piece of advice that you need, that push, that reminder that you actually are capable. Think about who that might have been for you in your life, those different mentors, those different guides that appeared at that right moment when you needed them the most. I also want to make something clear when we talk about these guide or mentor figures. I want to make it clear that they are not there to do the work for you. We had a message a couple months back called Inner Gold, where we talked about this idea in psychology that when you have some of these figures, these mentor figures in your life, there is this tendency to project some of your best qualities onto them. And the important thing to do is to remember that they are just there to show you all that you are capable of. They're not there to come in with all the answers. They are there to remind you that you have the answers, that you are capable of finding them yourself. And when you have that reassurance, you are ready for your departure. Now, what's important to remember about the departure is that it is the moment when you cross the threshold, that you are moving from the known and you are now entering into the unknown. You are crossing over into the non-ordinary world. If any of you have seen The Matrix, this is that moment when Morpheus, the guide, offers Neo a choice. You can take the blue pill or you can take the red pill. And if you take the red pill, you will enter into this non-ordinary world. But be warned, there is no going back. When Olivia and I moved to Arizona, we knew we were going into a new place, somewhat of a non-ordinary world for us. But it wasn't until this very particular moment that I realized that we had crossed the threshold into the unknown. And that was the moment when someone told us about javelina. If you're watching online, okay, I'm talking to you. If you're watching online and you are not from Arizona, javelina are these boar-like creatures that wander the desert primarily at night in packs of 20 or more. I know, right? And they love pumpkins for some reason. It sounds like something out of a fairy tale. I know. That's what I said. You have those moments where you realize, oh, we're not in Kansas anymore. For us, it's we're not in Seattle anymore, okay? Maybe that moment for you, it's when you quit your job. You said there's something out there for me more than what I'm doing right now. I need to step out of the known. Maybe it was that moment you left your family or you left single life and you got married. That moment when you left for college, you moved away for school. Maybe it was that moment when you left your church, your spiritual tribe, because you knew you were being called to something else. Or maybe it was an internal departure. It was that first moment when you just began to allow yourself to think a little differently. Thomas Lloyd Qualls says it about the departure. At one time or another, we are all called to leave the safety of our homes, the certainty of what we know, the illusions of who we are. Not everyone will heed this call, of course, and those who do will risk losing themselves completely, but if we choose to ignore the invitation, we risk never knowing who we might have become. We risk dying without knowing what it is to live. So we must do it, right? We have to. And yet, immediately, we begin to face trials. And we all know this point in the story, right? The heroes have set out on their journey, and immediately, it's not as easy as we thought it was going to be. And it's those moments in our lives when things start to get challenging, when you realize, I'm no longer in control. I don't understand this non-ordinary world. So you quit your job and then you start looking for something new, or you start trying to build something new and you realize, well, this is harder than I thought. You're newly married and you realize, well, this is harder than I thought. You get to college and you're like, well, this is harder than I thought. Maybe you left your church and you were so excited for that newfound freedom, and yet what you didn't realize was the pain of what would happen when everyone you knew before kind of turned on you. And so those difficulties, what they do is they actually start to prime us for this next stage called the approach. And what the approach is it's this moment in our journey when the trials have started to strip everything away. We started to question all previous assumptions that we had. We start to wonder who to trust, even if you're wondering, can I trust myself? And it's the approach that is the moment when you may most want to turn back. But it's actually the approach that is leading you forward. That's why it's called the approach. And what it's leading you forward into is the crisis. Now, I want to make something very clear. The crisis is at the 6 o'clock point. It's the exact counterpoint of 12 o'clock, the ordinary world. And in this sense, the crisis is the furthest from home, the furthest from ordinary, the furthest from the known that you will ever be. It's often even called the innermost cave. And it's that moment in your life, maybe you experienced what you would consider your dark night of the soul. You would consider your low. In some stories, it's a death. Maybe in your life it was a literal or symbolic death. It's that moment from which you are never the same. You go into the cave and maybe some things are permanently left behind in the cave. There is a really poignant example and very literal example of this stage in the Star Wars trilogy. And George Lucas, who created Star Wars, was incredibly influenced by Joseph Campbell. And there's this scene right at the midpoint of the second Star Wars film of the original trilogy. So even if you just envision the whole trilogy as as this clock, The Empire Strikes Back, the very middle of that movie would be the cave. And ironically, there is a cave scene. Sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to quickly let you know about an easy and free way that you can support Aldea. Did you know that between our YouTube and Apple Podcast channel, our online audience is often 2 to 3 times the size of our in-person audience? Not only do we value our online community, but we recognize how powerful it can be in spreading our message of love, period. So, how can you help? Like our videos, leave a comment, subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to our podcast, leave a positive review. All of these things go a really long way in increasing our visibility and help to get our messages out into the world. So we thank you for your help. All right, let's get back to the message. I want to go back through a couple of key lines from that scene. When it comes to the cave, in you must go. I love it. He's like, it's a very dark and scary place. In you must go. And Luke says, what's in there? And Yoda responds, only what you take with you. And friends, this, I believe, is the crux of the hero's journey. That whatever outer manifestations there are of challenges, of enemies, of trials, there is nothing that we will face more poignantly in our hero's journey than ourselves. And this is why we see Luke in this sort of dreamlike sequence. He doesn't face a literal enemy. He faces himself. He sees that he is there in the place of Darth Vader. So in we must go. And if we do, what we come out with is a treasure, a reward. By facing the dark, we now possess something that we never would had we not entered the cave. And in many stories, this treasure, this reward, is something literal. Many stories, it's a weapon, a potion, maybe it's a magical ability. And it's something that will come in handy later in the story. But also many times, it's not something so literal. It's something like a quality, a sense of self-assuredness, a resolve to complete your mission. This is that moment in The Lion King in which Mufasa appears to Simba from beyond the grave to remind him of his birthright, to remind him of his destiny. Maybe for you, it was a moment when you gained a self-knowledge that you hadn't had before. Maybe it was a moment in your career where after facing some of the lowest lows, you now had a resilience. Maybe it was a moment in your marriage where you faced some incredible difficulty, but then from that place you developed tools. Or maybe you didn't survive that difficulty. Maybe there was a separation or a divorce, and yet through that process, through that cave, you found a new sense of inner strength. Maybe it was that moment when you left your church and you really began to grieve that old identity, that old sense of belonging. But in doing so, you began to make room for something new to be born. And what is born from that place is transformation. And as the video before shared, this section of the journey will vary from story to story, but it is that point in which we are launched back on that path back home. It's that moment when you gain that resolve to complete the journey. And when you are on the road back, you actually cross the threshold one more time. Interestingly enough, Joseph Campbell commented that this was in many ways one of the most difficult moments in the journey. Because it's in this moment that we need to integrate all that we have learned and bring it back with us to our village, to our community. And this can be incredibly difficult. I know for many of us who, consider ourselves to be on a spiritual journey, I think that's all of us, and we have these moments where we get these insights or we have these experiences, and yet we struggle to integrate them back into our daily life. This can be a really difficult work, but it's an incredibly spiritual work. That moment when you realize, well, I'm different, so how do I be this new person in my old world. And your shadow will probably come along and say, oh, you really think you're all that? You really think you're capable? And you'll probably start to question yourself again. And this is why, if you press forward, you experience a resurrection. A moment when you fully make peace with the new you. And in some senses, this is the real climax of the story. This is like the final test that you are only able to pass because of all that you've learned along the way. We all know those scenes in movies where you think that the heroes are finally out of the woods, and then one last enemy appears at the last minute to remind them, and also to test them, and to really prove that the hero has, in fact, learned all that they have learned. In our travel to actually move to Arizona, Olivia and I drove this 1,500-mile journey, and we took about a week visiting different family members. And on our very last day, the home stretch, driving from California to Arizona, planning on being in Arizona on Sunday night, and I was going to start my first week at Aldea on Monday morning. And about halfway through our drive, in the middle of nowhere in the desert, our car breaks down. We have two cars, and one breaks down. And we both panic. And it feels like that test of everything that we've learned. We were almost there. You know those moments, you're so close. And so we both look deep within. We realize this is our resurrection moment, and we look back at all the lessons that we've gained thus far. And I find a deep, deep lesson from early childhood, from playing video games. See, in video games, when anything goes wrong, if you just mash enough buttons, something will happen. And so I got in Olivia's car, and I was like, I'm going to hit buttons until this car works. And I don't recommend this, and this is not my official mechanics advice. But I did. I forced that car into submission, and somehow it started again. So that wasn't the lesson that was really learned. Really, I think our resurrection was trying to stay calm and just, keep it together in that moment. But we all have those moments. You're like, I'm almost there, and then something just comes out of the woodwork. But if you can pass that final test, you can make your return, and you can truly bring all that you've learned back to the village, that you truly experience that moment of reintegration. Harry Potter, at the end of his first year at Hogwarts, returns to his broom closet, but he now knows that he is a wizard and no one can take that from him. Simba returns to his home at the end of the story, but now he is king. Cinderella returns to a sense of normalcy, but now she has found love in the context of being a princess. What are those moments in your life where you could say, now I know who I really am? And finally, we end where we started, 12, the status quo. But I've added a little plus sign here because it's not the same as where we began. We go back to the start, but we have changed. We have all the knowledge, the reward, the treasure that we gained along the way. And in many contexts, this is also called master of two worlds, meaning when you get back to your starting point, you now have the ability to move back and forth between the known and the unknown worlds. And often in a spiritual context, this is learning what it means to be both a spiritual and a physical being, to honor your humanity and to honor the divine within you simultaneously, not one forsaking the other. Now, what's the importance of going through all this and naming the path? It can be incredibly helpful to have language for the journeys that we are all on. It can be incredibly helpful as we name these different steps to see ourselves in different places, because then we might realize wherever you and I are on our hero's journey, it's not wrong. It's not a failure. it belongs. You are right where you're supposed to be. And if you have any confusion, if you feel like you're stuck, you can simply look to the next step and ask yourself how you can position yourself, how you can move forward. Campbell said, "Furthermore, we have not even to risk the adventure alone, for the heroes of all time have gone before us. The labyrinth is thoroughly known. We have only to follow the thread of the hero path. And where we had thought to find an abomination, we shall find a god. Where we had thought to slay another, we shall slay ourselves. Where we had thought to travel outward, we shall come to the center of our own existence. And where we had thought to be alone, we shall be with all the world." So maybe you're feeling this pull, that there's this creative project or endeavor that's been really calling to you. And yet there's a voice that's come up and said, "Do you really think that you can do this?" Well, maybe that's you experiencing the call to adventure and then the refusal to the call. But don't forget that the very next step is the appearance of a guide. So look out for that guide. Maybe you're experiencing some kind of family or personal crisis and it feels like a dark night of the soul. It feels like your cave. Don't forget that through the cave comes the treasure. Maybe you've come home, it's summertime, maybe you've come home from some kind of spiritual retreat or a trip. And as you make your return, don't forget to integrate all the lessons that you've learned into something that can be brought back to your village. Maybe you've moved away from your hometown and you're just now finally starting to feel as though you can move back and forth, that you can go visit, you can come back home, and you can maintain the authenticity of who you've become because you have started to learn what it means to be a master of two worlds. Now, this hero's journey that we go on, it's not a one-time thing. It's going to happen repeatedly over and over again. And each step of the way, it will be an invitation into a deeper and fuller experience of life. I'll close with one more quote from Campbell. "What I think is that a good life is one hero journey after another. Over and over again, you are called to the realm of adventure. You are called to new horizons. Each time there is the same problem. Do I dare? And then if you do dare, the dangers are there and the help also. And the fulfillment or the fiasco. There's always the possibility of fiasco, but there's also the possibility of bliss." So Aldea, go out into the world. Own your own hero's journey. And remember that whatever stage you find yourself on, that it belongs. That whatever difficulty you're facing, or whatever joy you're facing, it's all part of the story. So keep going. And remember that where you had thought to be alone, you shall be with all the world.